Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Mythic Plus has undoubtedly been one of the most significant shakeups to WoW's gameplay loop in the game's entire history. By Warlords of Draenor, dungeons were barely relevant at all. Mythic Plus managed to 180 that course and make them extremely relevant again, to the point that, nowadays, they're a staple of raiding progression. After all, the myth track gear you can get from your vault for completing a plus 10 is better than anything you can get out of heroic raids. And for many players, Mythic Plus itself is the core of their endgame. Now, for a time, as M Plus was finding its footing, we had fairly stagnant dungeon pools. That is to say, the pool was just all of the dungeons of the current expansion. This would make things pretty exciting in each Season 1, but fairly exhausting by Season 4. Realizing the need to add more variety to the experience, Blizzard started using a rotation in Shadowlands Season 4. Initially, this was comprised of the mega dungeon wings of the past 3 expansions, plus 2 fan favorites from Warlords of Draenor. The first 2 Dragonflight seasons featured 4 new dungeons apiece and 4 returning. Season 3 featured Dawn of the Infinite and 6 old dungeons. Season 4 was the 8 Dragonflight launch dungeons. The War Within Season 1 again gave us 4 new dungeons and 4 old. Season 2 gave us 5 new dungeons and 3 old, and Season 3 gave us the 4 most popular War Within dungeons, a new dungeon, and 3 old ones. And not much is changing in Midnight Season 1, which again features 4 new dungeons and 4 old ones. So in general, variety has certainly gone up. But an obvious trend anyone could notice is that more recent expansions tend to be favored. This makes perfect sense, as they are the dungeons who were designed with M+ in mind, and thus require the fewest modifications to be brought into a functional and enjoyable state. Everything from BFA onwards seems to be on the table. With the exception of Assault on Violet Hold, so does every Legion dungeon. Warlords of Draenor has had several inclusions, since challenge modes were the functional precursor to M+, and by that logic, Temple of the Jade Serpent from Mists of Pandaria also made it in. You might think that that was the limit, especially given how comparatively simple dungeon mechanics could get the further back you go. But, surprisingly, Blizzard reached back just a little bit further into Cataclysm and has given us 3 dungeons from there as well: Vortex Pinnacle, Throne of the Tides, and Grim Patrol. And as the Midnight Alpha has shown us, Season 1 of that expansion will actually go all the way back to Wrath of the Lich King and include Pit of Sauron. Sadly, the rate at which we're getting older dungeons seems like it's kind of tapered off, but I hope that's not the case, because I want every dungeon to have relevancy going forward. Heck, they started giving us dungeon teleports for beating them at a certain level, so now you've introduced a collection aspect to all of it as well. I know many players would scoff at including many early dungeons in the pool, or at least certain problematic dungeons. While I don't necessarily advocate for designing more overly exotic dungeons in the future, I say embrace the past. I don't just want older dungeons in the pool, I want every dungeon to have its time to shine, and I don't care how much work it requires on Blizzard's end. So let's take a look at what kind of chaos this would bring to the game, how exactly I wish the dungeon pool worked overall, and if this would truly destroy any form of balance or prestige present in the system. Our first step on our journey backward is Assault on Violet Hold. Already we've got issues popping up. After all, it's just one large room with waves of trash spawning from portals and a boss every 6 waves. There's not a lot of room for routing or decisions in what packs to pull. There isn't much room to improve your time either. You either make the cutoff to keep up with the waves, or you don't. And furthermore, wiping can be particularly punishing, as it could mean repeating a lot of trash. Lastly, there's the threat of being able to cheese stuff, as the respawn point is so close to the action at any given time. Let's address these concerns in turn. Although routing and pack choice is an important tenet of M+, I don't feel that it's so vital that it must feature in every single dungeon. I mean, already we have examples of dungeons that are extremely linear or have very little in terms of optional trash. This simply takes it to the extreme. I think the best way to keep a timer relevant and to deal with the overly punishing nature of wipes would be to simply replace the waves with 5 static groups that emerge from the various portal locations around the prison. I think there were already 4 or 5 possible locations, so this works out pretty well, and affords players with plenty of control over the pull size and speed at which they progress. 15 seconds or so after each boss is defeated, new waves could spawn in, giving the group time to get into their ideal position, or to pull back to the entrance and recuperate. Lastly, I don't think respawn cheesing is that big of a concern. There's already a timer penalty for every death, 5 seconds on lower keys and 15 seconds on higher keys, and most players know how painful it can be losing control of a pull only to have group members continuously spawn in, die, and shoo away at that timer. Another extremely relevant note is that Midnight actually introduces another dungeon which supposedly has a wave-based format, Void Scar Arena. I haven't actually looked at the dungeon yet, so I don't know how functionally similar or dissimilar it is from Violet Hold in similar instances, but at the very least it does indicate that Blizzard is willing to design new dungeons with a similar premise. So whatever they do to make this dungeon work in M+, just apply it to the older ones. Moving back into WoD, the only notable concern is Zeritak from the Everbloom. This boss was more of an inconvenience than an actual problem due to the wave-based nature of her fight, but it worked perfectly fine in challenge mode. However, Everbloom was revisited during Dragonflight, and I believe they simply made the encounter optional, which I think is a bit of a shame. Similarly, there's nothing about mop dungeons that present a real obstacle. If anything, the second boss of Siege of Nuzhou Temple. But again, that's more just an annoying encounter design and nothing that actually makes a key undoable. Heck, I think once he's active, the boss will just hang around if you wipe, so you wouldn't even need to worry about redoing the tower defense portion. Things start to get a bit more complicated once we hit Cataclysm. Most are fine, of course. 3 have already been adapted to M+, even if some mechanics had to be added or changed. Blackrock Caverns, Stone Core, Lost City of the Tol'vir, Shadowfang Keep, Well of Eternity, and Hour of Twilight could all be used with no real changes other than tweaking or adding mechanics for the desired level of challenge. Dead Mines would require a closer look as it consists of 6 bosses, and I don't think any M+ dungeon has exceeded 5. Furthermore, 3 of those 6 bosses are all located in pretty much the exact same spot and are faced consecutively. And, worst of all, before facing Vanessa Van Cleef, you need to perform the neurotoxin-induced gauntlet event that feels more like it was built as a one-time experience than to be done over and over again. I think the solution here is pretty clear. Cookie's encounter is already pretty silly, so you can just treat him as a mini-boss, the fake-out for the actual last boss. And I would relocate Rip Snarl down to where Mr. Smite used to be. And lastly, I would just cut out the neurotoxin gauntlet entirely. With this rearrangement, she'll have everything on the boat to serve as trash anyway. Halls of Origination faces a similar problem as it boasts a whopping 7 bosses. Notably, 4 of those simply occupy different alcoves surrounding the elevator at the end. In theory, you could simply split the dungeon into 2, the 3 lower bosses and the 4 upper bosses. The only problem with this is that the upper bosses would then have extremely little trash for you to have to contend with. It would almost assuredly make it the only key people want to run if they weren't targeting specific gear or raiding. Alternatively, they could change Setesh, Amunai, and Isiset into mini-bosses, with Raj as the 4th and final boss of the whole place. This feels a bit wasteful of some pretty cool designs. I honestly don't know what the best solution is here. Maybe they would need to add new trash or new areas to the dungeon to help justify the 2 halves being their own wings. Zul'Gurub mostly works as it has 5 regular bosses. The only wrench in it all is the extra Cache of Madness, in which you summon 1 of 4 random optional bosses. I don't think these are particularly important though, and they could simply be reworked as mini-bosses. Alternatively, you could treat the Cache as a proper encounter and split Zul'Gurub into 2 wings, one with the Cache, Vinoxus, and Mandokir, another with Kilnara, Zanzil, and Jindo. Heck, this would allow them to include mini-bosses that were cut from the original version. Thekkel the Tiger Boss, Marley the Spider Boss, Jeklik the Bat Boss, and Gazranka the Hydra you fish up could all be added for up to 10 boss encounters total, split into 2 5-boss wings. Or perhaps only some of them. There's a lot of leeway here, but I don't see any insurmountable issues. Zulaman again faces the issue of 6 bosses, but I think this is solved remarkably easily by splitting it into 2 wings. One with Akelzone, Nalarak, and John Alai, another with Halazi, Malakras, and Dakara. Additionally, make the possible adds that accompany Malakras consistent instead of random, or able to be chosen by the players in some way. Otherwise, we're good. Lastly, that leaves End Time, which has the main issue of the first 2 bosses being pulled from a pool of 4. Obviously, that creates way too much variance. I think the simple solution is to require us to clear out all 4 bosses before making our way to Murazond. Depending on what's simpler for Blizzard, they could either give us a choice about which order to do the first 4 Dragon Shrines, or make the order static, though the former would be preferable. So all in all, Cataclysm isn't too bad, with the main issues simply being that some dungeons are too large. Now then, let's look at Wrath of the Lich King. As always, mechanics would need to be looked at across the board to make things sufficiently complicated for the modern game. But aside from that, most dungeons would translate just fine to M+. I don't see any noteworthy issues with Utgard Keep, Utgard Pinnacle, the Nexus, Drak'Tharon Keep, Halls of Lightning, Ajol Nerub, or Pit of Sauron. Gundrak and Ahn'kahet, the Old Kingdom, also work completely fine, but feature optional bosses in the form of Ek and Monitar. But both of these are far more straightforward than Zeratak was, so I really see no reason why they shouldn't be mandatory. The Oculus could be a bit of an issue, as the Drakes were always an obtuse mechanic. Though I think modern players would be better suited to adapting to them, I think the proper solution is simply rework how they work, and in particular how the last boss works. But most of the dungeon is already usable. Violet Hold has all of the same problems as Assault on Violet Hold, and consequently has the exact same possible solutions, so I won't repeat them here. Although the first 2 bosses would have to be made consistent, I don't think I mentioned that earlier. Halls of Stone has an issue with the Tribunal of Ages encounter. Though it wouldn't be the end of the world to simply have one portion of the dungeon you have to wait on, I feel most groups would simply try to drag a ton of trash into it to save time. So a better solution would probably be to simply add a way to trigger new waves early, similar to the gong in Siege of Nuzhou Temple. Forge of Souls is mostly okay, but only has 2 bosses. No M+ dungeon has ever had less than 3, so I think it would be best to add a 3rd in somewhere before Bronjam. Hopefully it wouldn't impede the flow of the dungeon. Halls of Reflection raises a lot of issues. The trash for the first 2 bosses are currently wave-based, and furthermore, you're encouraged to simply line of sight pull them all to one of the side rooms, which isn't a super fun experience. I think the best solution that leaves the most room for speed to be reflected is the same as what I suggested for the Violet Holds. Have all of the trash for Phalaric spawn at once, but spaced out enough that you can choose how much to grab in a single pull. Once the boss is dead, after a few moments, all of Marwyn's trash will spawn. Get into your position before they do. The Escape from Arthas has a ton of potential to completely brick your key, but I feel like letting you restart on any wave would completely kill the vibe of the encounter. So I think what you'd want to do here is simply have it be a bit undertuned, so that it's not a likely fail point. If you can handle the first 2 bosses cleanly, this part shouldn't give you any real trouble. The Culling of Stratholme, while having a lot of RP sections and parts where you simply follow Arthas around, actually gives you a reasonable degree of freedom. After all, there was a whole element of clearing the place quickly to save the Bronze Drake. Still, it is a bit on the rails, so perhaps spawning all of the trash packs for Meathook and Salram so that you can pull at your own discretion, just as with the Violet Holds, would be the best solution. By far, the most exotic dungeon to use from Wrath would be Trial of the Champion. I think it's fine to still have the jousting portion at the start. It's out there, but we can have a little variety, can't we? Ultimately, we still wind up fighting the Grand Champions normally once they've been dismounted anyway. And I believe the 2 factions champions are functionally reskins of one another, but because 3 out of 5 bosses are chosen, it would need to either be the same 3 chosen every time, or all 5. Then you have a fair degree of freedom with the following trash. We hit another issue here because the second encounter was always random between Eodric the Pure and Argent Confessor Paletress. I think the best solution here is to simply include both fights, probably with another set of trash in between them. The dungeon already runs the risk of being too short, so padding it out with a 4th encounter and more trash would probably be a good idea. And then things finish fairly cleanly with the Black Knight. It'd still be a weird dungeon, especially for M+, but weird doesn't mean bad. Now then, on to the Burning Crusade, and honestly, almost everything here is already good to go if you don't count complexity changes. Hellfire Ramparts, Blood Furnace, Shattered Halls, Slave Pens, Underbog, Steam Vault, Mechanar, Botanica, and the Arcatraz are all pretty much good to go. Manitombs and Sethic Halls are as well, but I do want to point out that both have an optional boss in the form of Yor and Anzu respectively that I feel should be included. especially Anzu's, since otherwise Sethic Halls would only have 2 bosses. On that note, Alkanite Crypts actually has only 2 bosses, so, like Forge of Souls, they'd probably need to add one. There's plenty of space before the first boss though, so you can squeeze one in at the end of the first lengthy hallway just fine. Shadow Labyrinth has one contentious point with the second boss, Blackheart the Insider, who will periodically mind control your whole group and make everyone attack each other. It was not uncommon back in the day for this to result in a dead party member, which is a pretty steep consequence for a mechanic you can't avoid. I suppose you could simply expect your party to really spread out to reduce DPS uptime during the mind control, or to pop defensives beforehand. At any rate, I think it'd be reasonable to put some sort of protection in to leave players with at least 1 HP afterward. Personally though, I say leave it untouched. It's only the second boss, let's live a little. Magister's Terrace is very well set up for M+, but notably the third boss, Priestess Delrissa, will randomly have 4 out of a possible 8 adds with her. There would either need to be a static 4 or a way to manually influence who is included. Perhaps tie each one to a different trash pack or something. Then we have Black Morass, which I would treat exactly how we treated the Violet Hold dungeons. Granted, there are also wildlife mobs roaming around that you can factor in, but these are all non-elite and are there mostly for flavor, so we don't really need to consider them. Which really just leaves Escape from Durnhold Keep. Ultimately, this one will still be a bit of an oddity, but I think players exaggerate how bad it would be. Yes, certain elements would need to be sped up to preserve player sanity. Give Thrall an epic mount, for example. But I don't think the escort portions of the dungeon are so large that you need to change much. Just ensure there are enough checkpoints of sorts that wipes aren't catastrophic, and perhaps undertune the sections that could still be catastrophic. So then, all we really have left is vanilla dungeons, and yeah, this is going to be the roughest batch to adapt. Tons of mechanical changes would need to be made to make sure modern players with max level kits have an actual challenge, and many dungeons simply have way too many bosses to work as is. Thankfully, a fair number of them have already been updated with remakes, and we can simply skip over those. Ragefire Chasm is completely fine, though I suppose we can give Alliance players a safer way of getting to the instance, if we want to be boring about it. Similarly, Stormwind Stockades are completely fine, technically. It's just an incredibly boring layout, but so be it. And I suppose for parity, we can give Horde an easier way of getting into it as well. Wailing Caverns, at least the modern version, isn't as hard to work in as you would think, as you can fairly easily split its 8 bosses into 2 distinct wings. Based on the layout of the dungeon, this would mean Wing 1 including Lady Anacondra, Lord Pythus, Lord Cobron, and Mutanus the Devourer. You could even still include the escort portion so long as it's properly tuned and or has enough checkpoints. Wing 2 would start in the waters below near Kresh, and also include Scum, Lord Serpentis, and Verdant the Ever-Living, with you still jumping down afterward to collect your loot. Black Fathom Deeps is interesting. It technically has 5 bosses, and so could simply be considered one really long dungeon, but it also has 3 mini-bosses, so you could split it into 2 wings. I personally think the right call here is to just keep it as one long dungeon, and to have the mini-bosses give a high percent toward trash. I don't really think any major changes need to be made in that case, other than perhaps making that one jump early on easier, because that'd be an incredibly frustrating reason to brick your key. Gnomeregan is mostly straightforward. There are currently 5 official bosses that together have you explore almost the whole instance. Only the dormitory section feels truly pointless at the moment, but because we don't want to add a 6th boss, I guess I would simply make this area necessary or lucrative for trash percent. I'd also probably add some sort of movement speed buff somehow, as this place is entirely indoors and features a lot of very long corridors. Razorfen Crawl isn't too bad to adapt. It does have 6 bosses, but 5 of those are Quillbore. I think you can pretty easily cut one of them and nobody would even notice. I don't know, cut out Death Speaker Jargba or Agam Thorncurse to still give us a good coverage of the map. The larger issue here is the instance feels old, so I'd love to see how they modernize it. Razorfen Downs is overall quite straightforward. It has 4 bosses, 5 if you want to include the summoned boss Plague Maw, and is actually quite linear. I see no major obstacles here. Uldamon is an extremely weird case because Dragonflight gave us an updated version of it that half explored new halls and left the old version intact. and the old version is long, sprawling, and has 8 bosses, but a lot of those bosses aren't terribly interesting. Furthermore, the early parts of the dungeon are overlapped. Thus, I think what you do is simply cut out the start and instead begin at where the two deviate. This actually cleans things up very nicely. This new Old Uldaman would basically cover Obsidian Sentinel, Ancient Stone Keeper, Galgon Firehammer, Grimlock, and Arcadis. Unfortunately, this leaves Ironaya out of both wings, and since she does have a little lore connected to her, I think I would replace the Ancient Stone Keeper with her. Zul'Farrak is an utter mess. There are a lot of bosses, and for some reason, none of them are located in the front half of the instance. I think the right call here is to simply prune some of the more vestigial ones, as I don't know if you could make 2 good wings out of it. Keep Gazrilla, the whole temple battle thing, Antu Sul, Witch Doctor Zumra, and finally Chief Ukor's Blood Scalp and Ruzlu as the final and 5th encounter. This gets you to explore the vast majority of the dungeon. The trash areas between the fork and either Gazrilla or Antu Sul would be skipped, but that's up to the party and isn't that different from skipping the left or right side in Priory. The temple battle would probably require another pass to be cleaner as well. Maraudon is also a bit of a mess, but at least Blizzard had the decency to already divide the place into 3 wings for LFG purposes. This actually does a lot to clean things up and avoid confusion. The Wicked Grotto contains 3 bosses, Foul Spore Caverns contains 2, and Earthsong Falls contains 2, not counting rare spawns. So perhaps you would need to make some of those rares permanent bosses, or invent 1 or 2 more to make permanent. And thankfully, unlike most dungeons in this video we need to split into wings, the biomes look different enough that we get some proper variety. Dire Maul is in the exact same boat, pretty much. The Warpwood Corridor is already split into 5 bosses, and despite everything can actually be traversed without much backtracking. The Capital Gardens also has 5 bosses, though is a bit more bothersome in its layout. Still, nothing overly difficult or that can't be made smoother. The Gordok Commons has what looks like 7 bosses. These are literally all ogres, and most could be cut out without anyone even noticing. Cut out 2 of the guards if nothing else, or convert them into mini-bosses. Good gosh, Vanilla had a lot of dungeons. On to Temple of Atal Hakar then. The current version that cuts out the majority of the dungeon has 4 encounters and is very easy to adapt. I'm not gonna lie and say that the top and bottom sections of the dungeon are super interesting. Really, it's just the 2 rings and Atalarian in the bottom, even if it feels like a bit of a tragedy to have lost so much. At the very least, they could have Atalarian spawn after all the other bosses are dead, at which point you can jump down into the hole into the final encounter. This would still keep us at 5 bosses and keep all of the most interesting parts intact. Stratholme main entrance seemingly has 7 or 8 bosses, but we can easily trim 2 of them out. Keep Hearthsinger Forreston and put him in Festival Lane to make us go over there. Willy Hopebreaker to make us go down those side stairs inside the Bastion. Obviously Balnazar as the end boss, and of course Timmy the Cruel must be kept. The 5th boss can be whoever. I suppose Postmaster Malone is a good fit as he can be placed anywhere. Stratholme side entrance is fairly straightforward as well, save for the fact that we again have 6 bosses. And this time it's harder to decide who to cut. You kind of need to keep all 3 Ziggurat bosses, and of course Rivendare as the final boss, which leaves either Ramstein the Gorger just before him after defeating all of the abominations, or Magistrate Bartholas slightly before that. Both have a small bit of a lore attached to them, though not much, and I feel Ramstein is the more important one to keep. Lower Blackrock Spire is definitely a thinker. It's sprawling and interconnected enough that it can be hard to ensure your standard run would explore all of it. The 5 most memorable bosses for me would be Overlord Wormthalak at the end, as well as Warmaster Voon, High Lord Omak, Mother Smolderweb, and Halicon, though perhaps those last 2 could be swapped out or relocated to help ensure better coverage. I guess Quartermaster Zegris takes you deeper than Halicon does, and Mother Smolderweb doesn't really force you off the path you were taking anyway. Maybe swap her out for Shadowhunter Vosh Gajin, or I can just accept that some space won't be covered. I also don't feel like it would work well to split it into 2 wings, but perhaps? Which lastly brings us to Blackrock Depths. I already covered this in greater detail in its own dedicated video, but amazingly, you can run the place basically completely linearly and you can also divide it into 4 wings pretty well that way. The first wing would feature Lord Rokor, Houndmaster Grebmar, High Interrogator Gerston, and the Ring of Law, though that last one would have to be modified to not be random. The second wing would include Pyromancer Lorgrain, Warder Stilgis, Phineas Darkfire, and Lord Incendius. The third wing would include Baelgar, General Angerforge, Golem Lord Argylmek, and the Grim Guzzler. And the final wing would include Ambassador Flamelash, the Seven, Magmus, and Emperor Thaurissan. I do think that a more elegant solution would have been to push the Anniversary Remake raid to be more prominent, as getting 4 wings out of this place could be tiring, but I see no reason why those wings wouldn't actually work. So that's every dungeon that could be problematic as M+, and how I think they could be modified to fit the mold. And it's okay if some of them do break the mold just a little bit, honestly. I know these early dungeons just don't work as well as more modern dungeons for this function, but I also think it's sad that we're kind of leaving so much of WoW's history behind. I love all of WoW's dungeons, even the kind of janky feeling ones from 2004. Some modernization would be required, of course, but I think that's a lot better than being stuck with so many fewer dungeons. I mean, people were already complaining about Mechagon Workshop popping up for the second time in 3 expansions. Much as I like Workshop, I think it'd be much better to tap into the 146 dungeons/dungeon wings, at least according to how I divided them, that exist at the end of The War Within. Heck, even with a dumb 3-season expansion lifespan, we could see 24 different dungeons per expansion. And once we get an 8th Halls of dungeon, then we can finally have that meme season. So how would I suggest this actually be done? Well, I don't think much needs to change. A new expansion's dungeons would always feature ones. You could fill out the pool with some thematically appropriate ones if you want, and any whatever spaces could be filled with older dungeons that have been updated. I think 2 per season is a nice target that would still take us a long time to get through, though more is always welcome. Then, once any given dungeon has received such an update, throw it into the giant RNG machine to eventually be pulled back out. Add some bad luck protection so no dungeon has to go 16 years before turning up again. Is it a bit contrived? Would most people hate it? Probably. But this video is about what I want out of M+. I'm being selfish here and never said that I wasn't. Also, I think it'd be really funny to have a season of all of the most problematic dungeons at once. Violet Hold, Assault on Violet Hold, Black Morass, Escape from Durnhold Keep, Trial of the Champion, Halls of Reflection, Oculus, and the like. People would lose their minds, and I think it'd be pretty dang funny. For this week's drawing, I first decided on the setting, which would be Trial of the Champion, as it is, obviously, one of the more obtuse dungeons to try to fit into M+. But the most iconic boss we fight there is the Black Knight, who, he's cool and all, but he's just a Monty Python parody. So instead of him, I decided to feature Tyrion Fordring as the character on display, as he's the one hosting the Argent tournament. And I know he was wearing T6 at the time, but I decided to outfit him in the T10 that he wears during the Ice Crown finale cinematic, as it's what I best remember him in, because of that cinematic. But I did throw on the Argent Crusade banner for good measure. Unfortunately, it was really hard for me to get the color palette of this set to match, especially in tandem with the tabard. It was feeling a bit like a clown suit, and ultimately I decided to recolor certain pieces to make it work better. I mean, it works fine in-game, it's just the way I draw things, it didn't work out that well. So yeah, not the drawing I'm most proud of, but it's okay. As for Tyrion as a character, he's also okay. He did kind of just take over the role of Arthas's biggest threat from other characters who had far more direct interactions with him. But looking at it from modern times, I'm kind of glad that Jaina and Sylvanas didn't get even more spotlight shown on them. So I think it worked out okay. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye!